Debt collector harassed me 15 times a day. I sued and won $1.2 million. I had a perfect credit score, zero debt, and a peaceful life, until I started getting calls for a man named Robert Miller. The debt collector, Sentinel Group, was relentless. They called my cell phone, my office, and even my mother, demanding payment for a debt that wasn't mine. They called me up to 15 times a day. They thought they could terrorize me into paying them to stop. They were wrong. I sued them for violating the Federal Debt Collection Practices Act, FDCPA, and walked out of court with a $1.2 million jury verdict. My nightmare started subtly. One Tuesday, my phone rang. It was an automated message from Sentinel Group stating they had an important legal matter for Robert Miller. I hit 1 and explained to the agent, Mark, that I was not Robert Miller and asked them to remove my number. Mark apologized and promised to update the file. The next day, the calls doubled. Not only did they keep calling for Robert, but now they called from different numbers, often marked private. I blocked them that they used new ones. I was getting calls at 8 a.m., 11 a.m., 3 p.m., and multiple times after 7 p.m. The harassment was relentless. I wrote them a physical letter, certified mail, stating clearly under the FDCPA that they must stop all communication with me immediately. This is the legal equivalent of a cease and desist. The Sentinel Group ignored it. The harassment intensified. They started calling my workplace. My boss called me into his office, clearly frustrated. The collection agency was calling the main switchboard and falsely claiming I was avoiding a court summons. This was a direct violation of federal law, which forbids disclosing the debt to third parties. The stress was unbearable. I couldn't focus at work. Every time my phone rang, my stomach twisted in fear. I was suffering from severe anxiety and insomnia, all because of a debt that wasn't even mine. The true climax came when they called my 70-year-old mother. The collector told her that if she didn't help locate Robert Miller, she would be liable for his debt. My mother, terrified and confused, immediately called me, crying, convinced she was going to lose her house. That was the moment I stopped trying to be polite. They didn't just annoy me. They weaponized fear against my family. I realized I couldn't beat them by blocking numbers or writing letters. The Sentinel Group was operating illegally, betting that I wouldn't have the courage or the resources to fight back. They were treating federal law like a suggestion. I decided that for every moment of fear they had caused me, they would pay back 10 times that amount in a courtroom. I had stacks of voicemails and a detailed phone log, but a debt collector will always claim they followed the rules. How did I turn a list of annoying, repetitive phone calls into a massive federal lawsuit? And what specific law did my lawyer use to prove intentional infliction of emotional distress and demand a 7-figure punitive damages payout?
The moment the debt collector made my mother cry, I stopped thinking about settlement and started thinking about punishment. I needed a lawyer who saw the law not just as a defense, but as a weapon. I found Jane, a consumer protection attorney. I laid out my evidence. My handwritten log of every call, the dozens of blocked numbers, the certified mail receipt proving they ignored my cease and desist letter, and the terrifying voicemails they left for Robert Miller. Jane's eyes lit up. "OP," she said, "you don't owe them a cent, but they owe you millions." This isn't just harassment. This is a clear violation of the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, FDCPA. She explained that the FDCPA is a federal shield protecting consumers from abusive collection tactics. The Sentinel Group had committed 3 specific, severe violations: excessive contact, calling me up to 15 times a day after I told them I wasn't the debtor was clear harassment. Calling a third party, Calling my mother and my workplace to disclose information about a debt that wasn't mine was explicitly illegal. Ignoring the cease and desist? The FDCPA mandates they must stop all contact upon receiving a written request. They ignored a federal mandate. The FDCPA allows for statutory damages of $1,000 per violation, which sounds small. But Jane was aiming for something far larger: punitive damages and compensation for intentional infliction of emotional distress. To get that, we had to prove their illegal acts were intentional and reckless. We filed the lawsuit. Sentinel Group's defense was predictable. They claimed their agents were merely attempting to locate the debtor, Robert Miller, and that the high volume of calls was necessary. They claimed they never received my certified letter. This is where the discovery phase became our courtroom. Jane filed a comprehensive request demanding Sentinel Group produce 2 items they hoped we'd never ask for. First, every single internal call recording associated with my phone number. Second, the internal training manuals and commission structure for their agents. Sentinel Group fought us bitterly, claiming the recordings were deleted and the manuals were proprietary secrets. But Jane secured a court order. The materials were handed over, and the truth was worse than I imagined. The internal recordings confirmed that their agents were instructed to ignore soft refusals. In one chilling recording, I heard an agent, Mark, telling a supervisor that he was certain he had the wrong number, but the supervisor instructed him, "Keep hitting that number. It's marked hot. We don't stop until they pay up or get a lawyer. Don't waste time looking for Robert." The training manual revealed the smoking gun. Collectors received a massive accelerated commission bonus if they got a number marked hot to either pay or agree to a payment plan within 72 hours. Their entire system was designed to prioritize harassment and illegal coercion over legal compliance. This evidence proved the harassment was not a mistake. It was the official, malicious business model of the Sentinel Group. They had been caught red-handed using fear as their primary profit strategy. We now had overwhelming evidence proving criminal intent. But a jury award for emotional distress is notoriously difficult to calculate. How did my lawyer use my mother's testimony and my doctor's diagnosis of severe anxiety to convince a jury that the psychological damage caused by 15 phone calls a day was worth over $1 million in punitive damages?
The trial began. For 2 years, Sentinel Group had operated in the shadows, using fear and coercion. Now, we dragged their entire illegal business model into the unforgiving light of a federal courtroom. The Sentinel Group's defense was predictable. They tried to minimize the violation. Their lawyers argued that 15 calls a day was merely aggressive communication, not harassment. They claimed the calls were unfortunate mistakes and that my emotional distress was simply due to my pre-existing anxiety. They tried to paint me as overly sensitive. But my lawyer, Jane, systematically dismantled their lies. First, Jane put the company itself on trial. She introduced the internal call recordings and the training manuals as Exhibit A and Exhibit B. She projected them onto a screen for the jury to see, a flowchart showing that agents earned higher commissions for ignoring cease and desist letters. The jury watched in stunned silence as Jane proved that the harassment was not an error by one agent, but a corporate strategy to violate federal law for profit. Then it was my turn to testify. Jane walked me through the last 6 months of my life. I described the physical symptoms of the terror, the constant stomach cramps, the debilitating insomnia, the panic attacks every time a strange number flashed on my screen. We introduced medical records from my doctor showing the direct link between the harassment and the diagnosis of severe anxiety and emotional distress. But the most powerful testimony came from my mother. She walked slowly to the stand. She was frail and her voice shook when she described the day the collector called her. "The man told me," she whispered, looking at the jury, "that if I didn't help them find Robert Miller, they could take my house to cover his debt. I have lived in that house for 50 years. I didn't sleep for days. I thought I had failed my family." I watched the faces of the jury members. Several were mothers and grandmothers. Tears welled up in their eyes. At that moment, the case stopped being about a federal statute and became a moral fight against a corporation that preyed on the elderly and the vulnerable for profit. The defense attorney, realizing the emotional damage was catastrophic, tried to object, claiming the testimony was prejudicial, but the judge overruled him. Jane looked directly at the jury during her closing arguments. She summarized the law. The FDCPA allows for actual damages, my medical bills, and statutory damages, $1,000 per violation. She then turned to the main event, punitive damages. "We are not here to recover the small losses. We are here to stop Sentinel Group from ever terrorizing another elderly parent or vulnerable consumer again. We are asking you to send a message so loud that every debt collector in this country hears it. We are asking for a verdict that punishes this malicious corporate behavior, a verdict of $1.2 million. The jury retired to deliberate. The defense team, knowing they had lost the moral argument, began to panic. They knew that an angry jury, after hearing my mother's testimony, could return a verdict that was far higher than our demand. Just 2 hours later, the jury sent a note back to the judge. They had reached a verdict. The defense lead lawyer rushed over to Jane and begged for a deal. They wanted to settle immediately to prevent the verdict from being publicly read in court, which would trigger massive bad press and regulatory scrutiny. Sentinel Group offered a last-minute settlement of $750,000. It was less than what Jane requested, but it was almost $1 million. Did my lawyer accept the guaranteed money, or did we wait for the jury's verdict, risking $0, but demanding the full $1.2 million for dignity and to send a message that would change the debt collection industry forever?
The moment the jury sent out the note, the Sentinel Group's lead lawyer rushed to my side with a final offer, $750,000 in cash immediately. The condition was simple. We had to accept the money right then and withdraw the case before the jury verdict was read in open court. They wanted to buy silence and prevent the public from knowing the extent of their criminal fraud. $750,000. That was enough money to secure my family's future for years. I looked at my lawyer, Jane. She leaned close. "This is a guaranteed win, OP, but I think the jury hates them. We asked for $1.2 million. If we wage..." I looked over at the defense table. The collectors who had tormented my mother were sweating. The corporate lawyers looked terrified. They were betting on my fear. I stood up and spoke to Jane, loud enough for their lawyers to hear. "We are here for justice, not a bargain. Tell them no. We wait for the jury." The defense lawyer's face went pale. He knew the risk I was taking, and he knew it was a sign of absolute confidence in our moral position. The court clerk called the room to order. The jury filed back in, their faces solemn. My heart was pounding, and my mother gripped my hand so tightly I thought her bones would break. The judge asked the foreman if they had reached a verdict. "Yes, Your Honor, we have." The clerk read the verdict form.
First, the finding of fault. We, the jury, find in favor of the plaintiff, OP, against the defendant, Sentinel Group, for violating the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, FDCPA. Then came the numbers. First, actual damages, medical bills and lost wages, $50,000. Second, emotional distress and statutory damages, $150,000. Total compensatory damages, $200,000. The defense lawyers let out a small sigh of relief. $200K was manageable. But the clerk paused before reading the final line. This was the moment of truth. The punitive damages, designed to punish the corporation for their evil business model. The clerk read, "We, the jury, award the plaintiff, OP, an additional amount in punitive damages, in the amount of $1 million. $1 million. The total verdict was $1.2 million. The defense table erupted in muffled chaos. They had risked everything on their ability to intimidate me, and they had lost spectacularly. The jury had adopted our exact number, validating every tear and every sleepless night. The verdict was a disaster for the Sentinel Group. Because the award was made public, it immediately triggered investigations by the Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. The $1.2 million judgment was the beginning of their downfall. They were forced to lay off collectors, change their training manuals, and faced millions more in federal fines and regulatory oversight. I received the check, paid off my medical bills, paid Jane, and used the rest to buy my mother a small, debt-free cottage where she could live in peace. The real victory wasn't the money, it was the realization that I, an ordinary consumer, used the power of federal law to stand up to a corporate bully whose business model was built on fear. The lesson: the FDCPA gives you more power than you think. If a debt collector calls you repeatedly after you've sent a written cease and desist, or if they disclose your debt to a third party, like family or work, they are breaking federal law. Never pay a debt collector to stop harassing you. Instead, document every call, find a lawyer specializing in FDCPA, and turn their illegal harassment into a multi-million-dollar accountability verdict.